welcome everyone to the sessions on territory this spring, addressing the notion of materials, urbanism as material accumulation. And I can say that sessions on territory is for the first time co-curated and organized not only at the ETH, but between the two schools together with Harvard Graduate School of Design. Thanks to my co-curators and co-organizers, Assistant Professor at the GSD, Dr. Charlotte Malterre-Barthes, thank you so much, and Hans Hortig, doctoral researcher, doctoral candidate at ETH. Thanks so much for the collaboration. And a special welcome once again to the GSD students. We are honored to have a kind of a dual auditorium this time. And a warm welcome to our speakers and guests this afternoon, Jane Hutton, landscape architect and assistant professors at the University of Waterloo, and Galaad Van Daele, architect, designer, and ETH researcher who joins this afternoon as respondent. They will be introduced in a moment. So a few words on the background. Some of you are familiar with our program, some of you are new. We are running this series since a few years, concerned with the question, how should we envision the future of urbanism, urban design, territorial design, so let's say the spatial design disciplines in the urban field. And we ask ourselves if urbanism is to keep its relevance in the future as part of architects' education and practice, what should be its main characteristics? Under the term urbanism, we understand the range of related fields, as I mentioned, from urban and landscape design to urban and territorial research and many other spatial practices, including urban activism and arts. And also, as you understand,
no problem.
For us, urbanism is a field taken in an extended sense, but not a classical urban design understanding, but in fact, a broadened perspective that extends from cities to wider territorial scales and possibly even the planet as a whole. So in this sense, many different themes and disciplines are recombined in this expanded frame. And this spring we are in the 6th iteration of the sessions on territory, considering the notion of materials, material flows, material accumulations. And we are debating both material cultures of architecture and urbanism and spatial practices of material use that extend over a kind of range of situations, from the territories of resource extraction to the construction sites and to the spaces of everyday life. Can we reimagine these material cultures and spatial practices through the agency of design? So to give you a brief summary for those who haven't been with us from the beginning, we opened the series with Joshua Komarov, who put in focus the notions of islands and islandness as new geographies of power and exclusion that, as a matter of fact, influence much of those material landscapes and material flows around them. In the second session, we heard from Carola Hein about a thesis on the primary material of our civilization being oil and petroleum. We, of course, believe it. And in the third session, 2 weeks ago, we spoke with Sarah Nichols, who illuminated the socio-metabolist history of perhaps the second most pervasive material after oil, upon which modern life is built, the concrete. And tonight we will continue with wood and steel. And I, at this moment, with great pleasure, hand over to my co-curators, Charlotte Malterre-Barthes and Hans Hortig, to tell you a few more words about the collaboration and to introduce our guests.
Thank you, Milica. But as you said, it's really one of the silver linings of Zoom that has allowed us to somehow concoct that collaboration, which I think has been really fruitful and has allowed basically to look at both sides of the Atlantic to join forces on this common interest, which basically the seminar at the GSD has been trying to tackle, which I think also the work of Jane Mah Hutton that we will see today would be so much contributing to and really allowing us to understand somehow or let's say allow us for bridging the distance between design discipline on the one hand and extractivism and resource exploitation on the other hand, and how let's say seemingly irrelevant material details actually fit into this kind of global enterprise of extractive neoliberalism. So something that actually perhaps is chipping at the assumption that design is a neutral discipline. So very much something that we disagree with. So I will just, for those of you who are interested, I will simply share the link of the seminar so you guys can have a look. And I would say that we're very excited to see Jane's work, because we've been already working on producing a research video on materials, plaster wood, or let's say wood, concrete, brick, and steel mostly, and their political economy, and this kind of tracing of commodities from sites of production to sites of extraction, and also the kind of design work that is in there and what it means is really something we're very interested in and look very much forward. So thank you very much. And I will then pass the word to Hans to introduce our guests. So thanks a lot.
Hello also from my side. Welcome to the fourth installment. I'm happy to introduce today Jane Mah Hutton, who is a landscape architect teaching at University of Waterloo School of Architecture. Her research looks at the extended material flows of common construction materials. Recent books include the Reciprocal Landscapes, Stories of Material Movements, that we will hear about mostly today. She co-curated or co-edited also the book Wood Urbanism from the Molecular to the Territorial, and edited the book Landscript number 5, Material Culture, Assembling and Disassembling Landscapes from 2017. Her research has been supported by an EDRA, Great Places Book Award, the Robert and Stephanie Olmsted Fellowship, and the CCA Canadian Centre for Architecture Fellowship. As a respondent today, we invited Galaad Van Daele. He is an architect active in Brussels, Zurich, and Paris, investigating the construction of built and natural spaces by means of writing, design, and photography. He explores the way ideologies are embedded in images, objects, buildings, and territories. Galaad studied architecture in Paris and Berlin. He completed his education in the frame of a postmaster degree in architectural research. And since 2019, he's teaching architectural design at ETH as member of the Studio Anne Fontaine, and is working on his PhD thesis at the Institute of Theory and History of Architecture at GTA. I'm happy and look forward to the presentation and the discussion today, and leave the floor to Jane Hutton. Welcome.
Thank you, everybody. And thanks everybody for coming today. I'm sharing my screen here, and I press play, and then you see it, right? Yeah.
Good.
Okay. So yeah, thanks so much for the invitation and the format here. And it's really wonderful to meet all the organizers and whose work I'm really interested in learning more about as well. So my plan is to talk about this book, Reciprocal Landscapes, Stories of Material Movements, and talk specifically about the stories of steel and wood and some of the questions that they raise for me. So I am zooming into, I guess, Zurich and Cambridge, Massachusetts, and wherever else anyone may be. But I work in Cambridge, Ontario. This is Waterloo architecture that looks out onto the Grand River. And this river is the spine of this swath of land that was known as the Haldeman Tract, that was promised to the Six Nations of the Grand River in 1784 for their use forever. But on the right-hand side, you can see how the Crown has sold off largely most of this land, and it's now the metropolitan regions of Waterloo and Kitchener, and also where our university is. And this year, the Haudenosaunee land defenders from Six Nations camped out from early in the summer to recently at the site called 1492 Landback Lane, blocking a housing development on unceded land. And I wanted to start with this recognition of this land dispute because I'm trying also to understand how this context where I live and work is really related to the issues that are that come up in the project and the research, which I guess until recently I thought is quite different. Now I'm realizing maybe they're not. So this research really comes from based on like questions and interests I had as a landscape architect practicing. So really where are these materials that I'm specifying coming from, who made them, and what does this really have to do with the design, project itself? And it's something that I really loved, as a practitioner, this kind of most sensuous and kind of tactile moment where everything comes together. All these construction materials that one might be specifying are marketed heavily, marketed for the ways that they perform in a certain site, but it can often be harder to find information about their origins and their actual making. So on the one hand, designers are, reorganizing these materials in a place, in a specific site for certain effect. At the same time, those activities are reorganizing and transforming other landscapes elsewhere. And I think these are things we all, everybody knows about and thinks about in different ways. And this diagram visualizes the material flows around the world. And so we all know that material specification is not, which maybe used to be about selecting local materials for a job, is now absolutely a global engagement. And we can also see how over the last century, this diagram shows the raw materials consumed in the United States over the past century, how consumption skyrocketed at mid-century and shifted from renewables to finite mined minerals. And we can see in this, also in this graph, the alignment between GDP and material consumption, and some kind of echo of the history of capitalism as land is appropriated, grabbed, capital is accumulated, and materials are kind of disposed as if there were no limits. And then these kind of chapters in this book pretty much reflect these patterns, from soil exhaustion to deforestation to forced labor to mining over extraction. And in no way does one have to look very far to connect to those realities. And they really reflect the logical outcomes of a system based on using things up as if there were no limits. So in this book, I'm looking at 5 different construction materials: fertilizer, granite, steel, trees, and hardwood, all bound in New York City public landscapes. In each case, I'm examining the relationships between these two often distant places, where a material came from and where it ended up temporarily. The cases span about 150 years, and the idea is that each kind of reflects changing economic regimes, labor practices, design ideas, and public attitudes about resource extraction, and also ideas about whatever nature is and what a human relationship is to it. So in the book, there's a few kind of agendas that I'm trying to work on. One is I guess the most central one is to see materials not as fixed commodities, but as continuous with landscapes that they come from, continuous with people's livelihoods and habitats of people and other species. The second is to see how these seemingly unrelated faraway places are actually co-created. So deeper quarries in one place means material improvements in another. And then third, to see how these material movements are related to design agendas. How do these ideas and concepts that designers use and intend for map onto the real relations of material production? So this map shows the trajectories of these different materials and where they landed in New York City. Today I'm just going to show a slide from each of them, but I'm going to talk about the third and fifth chapters on steel in Riverside Park from the 1930s, and then Ipe wood and the High Line from the 2000s in a bit more detail. And you can see these both relate to this rail line that's running up the west side of Manhattan at different moments in time. So the first chapter traces a small amount of guano fertilizer used on the lawns of Central Park in the 1860s to the Chincha Islands of coastal Peru, where it came from. It focuses on the growing metabolic rift of urbanizing centers, and concerns about disconnections from local organic cycles and guano's relationship to soil exhaustion, Atlantic and Pacific slavery, and the development of the contemporary chem lawn. The second chapter follows granite blocks from the Fox Islands of coastal Maine to smooth the pavement and the flow of capital on Broadway in New York City in the 1890s. Around this time, the cities of the Atlantic seaboard were exploding, and granite was being used to construct all kinds of monuments and buildings and to pave the streets. And the chapter focuses on solidarity between quarry workers in Maine and paving layers in Manhattan, as their striking disrupted the flow of granite in response to exploitative working conditions. So the third chapter, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more, follows steel from U.S. Steel's Cary blast furnaces on the Monongahela River in Pittsburgh to Riverside Park on the Hudson River in Manhattan. And essentially, as granite gave way to concrete reinforced with steel, it sprouted everywhere as towers, bridges, and rail lines in the 20th century. And the chapter looks at how steel was used to construct Riverside Park and the rest of the city. Steel making really transformed the Pittsburgh Riverside, as well as a constellation of extraction landscapes. It looks at the role that steel itself played, as well as progressive legislation in the construction of a new modern public landscape and the support of organized industrial labor. So this is a shot from the top of the Central Promenade in Riverside Park. You can see the Hudson River on the left side there. And when you're up there, it's really easy to miss the fact that you're actually walking on a tunnel, a rail tunnel, until a train runs through and the ground shakes a little bit. And when Riverside Park was first built, which was designed by Frederick Olmsted originally, was constructed in 1874. These same tracks, which you can see on the left here, were already well established, and the park was relegated to the land upslope from the tracks. So this was a really important rail line, bringing produce and live cattle to downtown markets, and a lot of active industrial uses were taking place on the shore. And for decades, tension between these industrial uses, different civic agendas, and also especially the wealthy uptown neighbors who didn't like the smell and noise, played out. And in 1929, plans to cover the tracks and extend the park into the water were finalized, but they were disrupted by the stock market crash of the same year. So this is the Monongahela River, about 370 miles to the west around Pittsburgh. And this riverside at the same moment was also very contested and congested. So for the growing steel industry, Pittsburgh was a strategic location. It was close to coking coal, Great Lakes ore routes, and Midwestern markets. If you, in this photo on the right-hand side, you can see the Carey furnaces and the hot metal bridge, which takes the molten iron to the Homestead Steelworks across the river. As Pittsburgh became an industrial center, steel production changed the shape of the rivers and also the colors of the water and sky. Waters were channelized, dredged, and landfilled to construct industrial facilities, and meanwhile destroying biological communities from wetland sedges to shellfish beds. The river took in toxic industrial waste, acid mine drainage, and raw municipal sewage. By the turn of the 20th century, this kind of smoky landscape led a lot of people to liken the city's vista to hell. Typhoid death rates were 3 times that of other cities, disproportionately affecting Black and new immigrant residents. So residents in Pittsburgh really had little access to the increasingly toxic and obstructed rivers and began to see them as really industrial and strictly industrial. And so incidentally, it was Frederick Law Olmsted's son, Jr., who was hired to develop a kind of city planning document. And he really argued that civic and industrial uses were not incompatible. And but he said, what's essential is that there's actually public access to the riverfronts. And so this is a plan that he made. But despite that planning document, the city neglected to acquire very much parkland along the river. And basically kind of privileging the steelworks over the mutual access. So this is kind of contemporary shot of 2 of the remaining Carey furnaces that operated until about 1896. And here is the rest of them. And throughout the century, a nearly continual stream of molten iron flowed from these blast furnaces, crossing the river, entering Homestead's mills, and leaving as structural steel members and plates. This complex was about 420 acres on both sides of the river, and really it kind of serves as an example of large-scale integrated industrial works that defined American industry in the 20th century. I met this guy, Ron Baraf, who works for Rivers of Steel, an organization that works to preserve and reactivate the area's industrial structures. And he grew up in Pittsburgh when Homestead shut down. So his whole life has kind of been about observing the decline of the steelworks and the afterlife. I'm there because I visited because I really was having a hard time sourcing the 1930s Riverside steel. And I had found a small clue that the American Bridge Company, a nearby manufacturer, had supplied a significant amount of steel to cover New York Central tracks around the same time. So it's a bit of a tenuous connection of all of the cases in the book, but it's the kind of evidence that I decided to go with. And Ron, maybe just being a good sport, suggested that he thought there was as good a chance of any that Riverside steel came through Carey and Homestead. As Carnegie Steel bought the Carey furnaces in 1898 and consolidated as U.S. Steel in 1901, the company gained control of vast ore and fuel supplies, rail networks, and kind of an expanding portfolio of facilities and complexes. And they made powerful alliances to expand the company's market reach. Basically, I think you can look at U.S. Steel's history. Like, U.S. Steel is so huge that it was really kind of just called the corporation. And it really demonstrates the strategies of monopoly capitalism to reorganize and control huge expanses of land and enormous labor resources. And so I found it personally overwhelming to even get my head wrapped around the scale of this operation, but evidence is everywhere, and including the small granules that we walked on that site visit. like these iron ore pellets. So we walked through, Ron and I walked through the former ore yard and picked up different things from the ground. So little pieces of iron ore, like shown here, puckered black coke and chalky limestone, which are the precursors of pure iron, and then aerated slag as well that had been skimmed off the top of molten iron. So the iron ore pellets came from Minnesota's Mesabi Iron Range, a 110-mile long iron ribbon that settled there about 2 billion years before, when photosynthetic cyanobacteria released spectacular amounts of dioxygen into the Earth's no oxygen environment. So at this moment, all the dissolved hematite and magnetite in the waters rested with the oxygen and settled on the ocean floor in a dramatic process that, and I love this term, one geologist calls the rusting of the Earth. When these banded iron formations ended up near the Earth's surface, speculators saw a profitable material resource. It was close to the Great Lakes, making this landscape a linchpin in 20th century industrialization. For the US Steel, this land provided 3/4 of all of its ore and 1 billion tons of ore by the time Riverside Park was completed. The next step in consolidation of the integrated corporation is transportation. And so the corporation secured steamship companies to float ore through the Great Lakes, and then railroads and all of the infrastructures required to get the ore to Pittsburgh. So the second element, coking coal, came from Connellsville, which became the primary fuel. And partnering with Henry Frick, the company gained control of 2/3 of the region's coal reserves. The next piece is limestone, which serves as flux, the reducing agent that draws out impurities from the iron ore, binding with them to become slag. And by the turn of the century, the company owned 75% of the Pittsburgh Limestone Company and operated quarries nearby. So all of these kind of ongoing streams of ore, coke, and limestone flowed towards Carey furnaces and many other places, each step a part of the integrated US Steel Works kind of monopoly. It wasn't a monopoly, but it was a yearly. So Ron, takes me around generously, kind of showing me the operations and narrating how they were working 100 years earlier. So he describes as the ore and the limestone and the coke go up the furnaces in carts and then are tipped in cycles into the furnace shafts. And as they fall through the furnace, the iron melts, it's collected at the bottom, and limestone binds non-metallic minerals into a foamy slag, which floats on top and then is kind of skimmed off. And this slag goes to basically build these giant landforms in surrounding areas at Brown's Dump, one of which has a big mall on top of it now. And the molten iron headed across the hot metal bridge to Homestead. And there it's combined with scrap steel, limestone, and other additives. It's cast into ingots and then rolled and shaped, and then further sent to manufacturing plants like the American Bridge Company in nearby Ambridge, where they were cut, welded, assembled, and shipped. And by the 1920s, 1/4 of national steel production was headed to the New York kind of metropolitan region. So steel was, we all have a kind of image of this as steel's just kind of erupting into new towers and infrastructure. And at the same time, Wall Street is solidifying as a global financial center, and industrialists are multiplying their fortunes in steel towers. So both as kind of physical matter, but also as real estate speculation. And this speculation is part of the machinations of the crash, the stock market crash of 1929. So of the many WPA infrastructural projects that emerged as a response to the crash through New Deal administration, this, the Robert Moses-led West Side Improvement, which you can kind of see here in this, or you can see the northern part of this, in the photo here, connected Lower Manhattan, so including what would eventually become the High Line, up to the Bronx with freeway, park, and rail connections, including the renovation of Riverside Park. So this was the city's largest kind of infrastructural project ever. And this was celebrated infrastructural feat, but it involved a discriminatory cost savings. So Moses prioritized park spending between 72nd and 110th Street, which is essentially what we can see here, where the wealthiest and whitest residents lived, and spent about a quarter as much north of 125th Street, where the population was poor and where Black communities were concentrated. So this was an intentional calculation that freed up $30 million, which was not insignificant at the time for kind of like conceiving and completing the project. The roofing of the rail tracks and expansion and filling of the shoreline and the smoothing of the grade between Riverside Drive and the Hudson River, which you can see here, produced 53 new hectares of parkland. So encampments of people who were living on the river, of which there were many at the time, and they were evicted. And by January 1936, acres of steel had been installed. So steelworkers installed prefabricated rigid steel frames made of plates and angles, riveted together in intricate patterns up and down the river's edge over top of the existing rail line and connecting, south to the west side elevated highway. And once steel roofing was complete, highway construction and topography and planting followed. This, the kind of all of a sudden the rail was covered and enclosed and kind of quiet. And I love this. This is from the celebratory brochure from the opening of the park that says, "Above these covered tracks are grass, trees, and sunlight." It's very romantic, and kind of celebrates the fact that there's now been this kind of integration of infrastructure with a more kind of seamless public space above. In the same year that the Riverside Park's renovations were completed, and also prompted by New Deal legislation or supported by New Deal legislation, U.S. Steel shocked the nation by signing an agreement that recognized full union representation, establishing an 8-hour workday, a 40-hour work week, and grievance procedures. And this was really kind of an indication of the growing power of industrial unionism. So I think the fact that, the simultaneous fact of the closing or the finishing of Riverside Park renovation and the signing of the U.S. Steel labor agreements reflected a moment when the power between industrial corporations and the public was being reorganized, so physically and socially through, and kind of steel is a really important player or participant in this. So the chapter goes on to explore the changes that occur in both places. Here in the rail line in Riverside Park, as it's abandoned in the 1980s and becomes home to a community of people whose story was documented by photographer Margaret Morton, like here, and also was featured in the film Dark Days. And also goes to look at the steel as the steel industry leaves Pittsburgh, taking jobs and leaving brownfield sites everywhere. So that's steel. And then the fourth chapter is about London plane trees and looks at a relationship between a community-driven planting of London plane trees on 7th Avenue in Harlem and the Rikers Island Tree Nursery where they grew. And this chapter looks at the interdependencies between urban street trees and residents who breathe near them and advocate for them, and looks at the kind of longer term collective rearing of the trees as they persist in landscapes, decades after, and the unrecognized labor of unpaid and incarcerated workers in that care. So just check the time here. So the last chapter is, which I'm going to get into a little bit more, traces Ipe. So probably well known to everybody, the slow growing deciduous tree whose wood is so beautiful, so durable and hard and rot resistant, from northern Brazil to, and in this chapter, I'm tracing it from northern Brazil to the first phase of the High Line. So in a forest, we can really understand decay as an essential process of ecosystem cycling. But when it comes to lumber, decay is a problem in an otherwise ideal building material. In the US, coastal redwood, Sequoia sempervirens, was a decay-resistant, or is still a decay-resistant wonder material. It's beautiful, versatile, and easy to work with. It's fire-resistant, and the sapwood is rich in polyphenols, making it tough against fungi and insects. These, I think, as we all know, the Pacific old growth redwoods were enormous, and they were notoriously over-harvested. It was used for everything, for luxury interiors, but also the basis for a new lower cost suburban and workers' bungalow. It was exported all over the world for infrastructure, mine shafts, stadiums, and the building of America's banana empires. Forestry reports really claimed that there was so much of it that it was almost impossible to deforest. And advertising campaigns like here on the right-hand side marketed the wood based on the romance and mystery of the world, of the wood's former status as this kind of ancient living, the most ancient living thing. At the same time, we can look at another prized and durable wood of the time, mahogany, and following colonial trade routes from West Africa and the Caribbean. And you can see how it was marketed to North Americans with colonial aesthetics as well. So redwood, redwood is kind of being used in all kinds of construction, but it also became a really important part of the new modern domestic deck, residential deck. And landscape architects started to use decks as a really central design feature to unite interior and exterior. And this is landscape architect Thomas Church, a spokesperson for the California Redwood Association, talking about how it was his very favorite material to use. So even though California redwood populations were absolutely dwindling, the wood was still marketed into the second half of the century as if it was limitless. And by the 1980s, as populations were decimated, this kind of leads to the adoption of more chemically treated softwoods in the decking market. So pressure treated wood preserved with chromated copper arsenic was affordable, it was more affordable, reliable and ubiquitous, and was kind of appeared in all forms of playground structures and suburban decks. It combated rot, but it also leached highly toxic compounds into soil, water, and people's bodies. And so by 2003, the EPA called for a voluntary ban on using lumber treated with CCA, and its use diminished or changed, evolved, let's say. So around this time, you can see local hardwood prices were rising, and tropical lumber imports in the United States increased by 400%. So here, these are ads from Landscape Architecture magazine in the 1970s, and they're offering benches and site furnishings in teak, ipe, mahogany, and purple heart from South America. So all of a sudden, designers had access to previously unknown woods, all promising better than redwood properties and without chemical, toxic chemical treatments. It's like a new, kind of new wave. And so when the first phase of the High Line was constructed, which is the end of the the rail line that I talked about in the steel chapter, ipe was the wood of choice for its decks, stepped seating, and furniture, and really is kind of the best practice of the time in terms of durability. And these qualities have really made ipe one of the most popular types of commercially available wood for higher end residential decks and boardwalks and parks. But like old growth redwood, ipe is very slow growing, and so its use is controversial, raising questions about the sustainability of its harvest. So 4 months after the High Line opened, activists from the Rainforests of New York campaign hung this banner, which challenged the sustainability of tropical hardwood certified by this Forest Stewardship Council. And the campaign really, made a point of claiming that New York City was the largest consumer of tropical hardwoods in North America. The supplier for the first phase of the High Line is located in Belém, or this is a kind of an American company that distributes from Belém. And Belém is a city at the northern tip of the Brazilian Amazon. And this is a port where rubber, cacao, lumber, and other valuable materials have flowed out of the forest for centuries. And so I was lucky enough that Marley Nogueira from the Instituto Floresta Tropical, which is an independent sustainable forestry research and training organization, was kind enough to offer to show me some ipe growing in the forest plot, several hours of a drive upriver from Belém. So Marley kind of clears a path to find this purple ipe, and it's about 1.5 meters tall and wide and about 40 meters tall. And there's multiple species which are known commercially as ipe, and these can all be found between in a range from the Brazilian Amazon all the way up to Mexico, but they appear at extremely low densities. So one tree may be found every 3 to 10 hectares. They have these really fine winged seeds that as they fall get caught in foliage or get eaten quickly by because they're delicious to deer on the forest floor. And the seedlings, if they are lucky enough to establish, require very specific lighting conditions to survive. So all of these traits, along with their characteristic very slow growth, produce a population of trees that is mainly made up of old, large adults and of just a few juveniles. So all of these traits and its very high dollar value make it especially vulnerable to legal and illegal overharvesting. So this is Marley, and he explains that ipe was chosen as the Institute's emblem because it represents is kind of like a core example of the current crisis. The desire for this kind of highly valuable yet sparsely distributed trees like ipe exacerbates deforestation in the Amazon, pushing the logging frontier further into unlogged forests and catalyzing all kinds of landscape transformation like road construction and agricultural grazing. So mahogany had a very similar history, similar characteristics, growing characteristics, and therefore was greatly overharvested. It became endangered in the 1980s, but was legally protected. But as ecologist Mark Schultz concludes, ipe is the new mahogany. So the same kind of patterns are unfolding with once one species is protected, it's kind of transferred onto this other species. So, officially logging companies have to produce a sustainable forestry management plan and follow restrictions about the quantities and types of trees that will be harvested. And the sawmills here in the north of Belém process logs that arrive by river and road from different regions of the Amazon. And then US distributors purchase sawn wood and ship it directly to Brazilian mills, from Brazilian mills to New York City's port in this case. So each shipment has a unique number and a set of documents that describe its chain of custody. And according to the Brazilian government, this system has significantly increased its ability to control illegal logging and curtail deforestation. The paperwork is so arduous, the distributor tells me that illegal companies really have a hard time surviving. On the road back from the field station, we see officials from the state's environmental secretariat stopping trucks loaded with logs to check their documents. And this legal paperwork, Marley says, is really important, but it also can provide an administrative mechanism for concealing illegal wood. So just as it's nearly impossible to really understand the extent of illegal logging, it's difficult to grasp the labor conditions that surround it. In some cases, illegal logging activities involve what's known as debt slavery, and in the state of Para alone, an estimated 25,000 people that are working in landscape conversion, including illegal logging, live in this state of forced labor. So the chapter gets into different perspectives on wood certification. It's very complex topic with many perspectives, but also including that of ecologists who suggest that by reducing logging intensity, it's not possible to sustain the production of ipe lumber under current sustainable harvesting levels. So these authors recommend further protection of the species, kind of like what happened to mahogany, but also suggest incorporating silvicultural techniques that could improve seedlings' chances of survival. So this is the experimental plots surrounding the Forest Management Center, and these techniques are being tested on plantations and forest gaps from seedlings collected from mature trees. So a kind of forestry cultivation. And maybe it's, there's an idea that it's these types of techniques that could one day make the commercial harvest of slow-growing trees like ipe a more tenable idea. So future phases of the Highline incorporated reclaimed teak and other salvaged hardwoods, and soon after the New York City Parks Department announced a moratorium on old growth tropical lumber for public parks. So this was a big victory for the Rainforests of New York campaign that really got a lot of traction. And we can see a move to use reclaimed lumber, like in Brooklyn Bridge Park, designed by Michael van Valkenburg and Associates, and a growing use of black locust, a local domestic rot-resistant wood that's kind of gaining popularity as well. So this story, or this chapter, contrasts the slow growth of ipe and the fast rate of obsolescence and development in neoliberal Manhattan, as the High Line becomes a symbol of an archetypal neoliberal space, as the public landscapes, institutions, and jobs that were discussed in the steel chapter give way to more privatized arrangements. This happened, and all of this is happening in the aesthetics of obsolescence and the reused steel structures of a relocated industry. Tropical hardwoods really gained, excelled beautifully because of their ability to withstand tough weather and kind of endure. But this photo showing the boardwalk, showing some of the boardwalks in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy that show this kind of pile of ipe, teak, and kumru hardwoods, reminds of how easily that which is durable can be crushed in the face of climate-driven weather events. And I think, it's a real challenge for me to kind of think through all of these different considerations and, what is obsolescence and what is a reasonable duration and what does it all mean? So here to wrap up, seeing a piece of wood decay over time, you can first notice the softening of the surface, the slow digestion of the outer fibers, and then later the wood becoming spongy or brittle before it eventually surrenders and falls apart. A sign of failure from some perspectives, this ability to degrade is also one of wood's most significant traits, unique in the palette of conventional construction materials. Sapwood cells have their own mechanisms of defense, but ultimately they give way. Their own demise ends up supporting the forest as a whole, cycling carbon and other nutrients through the soil. Their fragility is their future strength. Observing decay is a reminder of the relationships that allow ecological systems to thrive, endure, and regrow. Decay is a useful metaphor for thinking about how and what to construct in this age. We can think about the prior life and design, we can think about the prior life and design for the afterlife of the materials that are engaged. At the same time, the process of decaying wood is also not a metaphor, but simply one of the pathways that sustains human life and other life on which we depend. So that's where I'll end, and thanks for listening and looking forward to the conversation with Galaad.
Thank you very much, Jane. And there is a Zoom applause we can see in the auditorium. That was really, really great and really kind of a special, I would say, aesthetic experience also to watch your images. So I would ask you, I mean, perhaps. We have started the conversation before the lecture began. In a way, the kind of project that you undertook in this book is I guess it's an idea that many people, had, to say so, following a kind of concrete material back to the site of origination, but we rarely realize it. I mean, of course, it's a story of, I would say, contemporary designer that, you know, we design in the conditions of the kind of abstracted geographic characteristics. So the materials that we use are lacking in a way geographic pedigree, no? And that is precisely the characteristic by which they are turned into commodities, and they are in a way stripped of their, you know, symbolic significance, cultural significance, you know, all the social connotations surrounding them. So that anonymity and abstraction is the kind of condition upon which we design, no? And so in a way, this of course, experiment that you undertook, of course, is absolutely crucial in kind of revealing the ethics of that, of those conditions, right? And the kind of possibility of change. So I'm curious, I mean, just to hear a little bit more on the background of the project, no? How did you come up with it? And perhaps tell us a little bit more, I mean, what does it, you know, how did it change your perspective, let's say, as designer, you know, in a more general terms? I mean, obviously, did you find what you expected, or, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, what was particularly illuminating in this whole exercise, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, I think the project came from the thing. I think everybody wants, or in the specifying materials, there's these questions are always there. They're always part of the conversation, but there's really, I guess I found myself with the time to do it as a research project. And so it seemed like something to take advantage of. And I think exactly like you just said it beautifully, I think I felt incredibly like alienated from them, and working actually at the GSD materials collection, I was just kind of overwhelmed with all of the marketing. You know, it was like new, every material that we were getting was like kind of like eco something, new something. And it just seemed so suspect. So you can even, you know, like the things that are being marketed as kind of eco materials are really foregrounding their origin, but it still feels so unknown. Like it still kind of feels like a checkbox. And so I guess I thought in the kind of more archival writing project, it's possible to start to see what's not part of the checkbox, like what can't be, you know, quantified in a kind of sustainability list, and I guess it came to be like everything, you know. So as far as what was surprising, I actually think, and like we were talking about a little before, it's like it's very obvious project. And I think what was surprising to me was how, both how everything leads to something interesting, but also everything leads to something terrible, like very, very disturbing. And I couldn't, and sometimes like, maybe not so much in these chapters, but there's like, in the book, there's like, so many intersections with slavery. I mean, there is actually in the wood as well. And a lot of like really horrendous situations. And at first I thought, is that just because of materials I chose? But no, it's not. It's really the way the world is made. So that was like a kind of devastating realization that, you know, maybe should be more obvious, but it wasn't to me. Yeah. So that, I think that was the biggest thing. I mean, as far as, yeah, maybe that's a response.
I mean, I perhaps I'm curious about one specific point, you know, that let's say, I can refer to an interesting old text by a philosopher, a Swiss philosopher, who is in his old age now. His name is Claude Raffestin, and he has this text called Rural Origins of European Culture. And it's quite a small and a kind of obscure piece, but there he speaks about something interesting, which is that we tend to forget that material urban cultures are essentially built upon material culture that is rooted in the rural context. So that with the transfer of materials, that materials were historically not shifted just in form of cut lumber and brought as a kind of anonymous load, but in fact, let's say craftsmen were those who migrated and who brought materials with the actual knowledge of construction, right? So we have, I think with us today, maybe Metaxia Markaki, who researches Arcadia in Greece, and a part of that research is about these traditional craft villages and the kind of seasonal migration of craftsmen, right? Who basically, so you could say they're the kind of keepers of materials, right?
Yeah.
Of the territories of extraction. So somebody knows how to harvest the materials, and those people actually also know how to build with them, right? So in a way, not only that we lost the kind of, to say so, geographic awareness, but I think that this idea that there is a kind of, that there is an agency or an active protagonist who is in charge of, to say so, cultivate that culture is something which is really forgotten, right? So I'm curious whether you came across these to say so, cultural, the kind of thoughts on the kind of cultural ramifications of this, so in a way it is very devastating that we are at the kind of material limits, and that one endangered species will be replaced by another endangered species, and so in a way the kind of process seems to be obviously, I mean, fueled in an unsustainable way. But I'm wondering, what are the limits culturally, right? I mean, can we as designers, to say so, sustain or produce the kind of interesting or innovative, to say so, ways of working?
That's so interesting. Way, right? Yeah. I know that's a really so much to think about there. I mean, one of the places, I don't know if you were speaking to like specific like material, whether it was like stone or wood, but I keep coming across so many interesting examples of, let's say, architectural conservationists who are looking at old wood buildings and finding, I guess through like dendo or archaeology, finding evidence of knowledge about working with the wood, but also about forestry management. Like they're seeing these kinds of relationships. So I think your point about the kind of like inherent knowledge in knowing a landscape and the building, it's just really wonderful to see that, to see examples of that, because it also seems like a great model that perhaps the act of designing doesn't need to be completely separated. So I think it's also not to look back too far, or to, you don't really have to look that far. I mean, obviously there are practices like this happening all over the world in so many, kind of exciting ways. But I also am thinking about the work of a master's student at Waterloo, Lucy Lynn, who's looking at kind of deconstruction practices and working with Willowbank College, which is a nearby kind of craft school, and thinking about like how does this new kind of age of where deconstruction hopefully will be a more central role in building trades. What does that have to do with some of the kind of craft still ongoing, like maybe seemingly of the last century, but still happening in Southern Ontario. How do those kind of intersect? So for me, that's kind of a way to bring that to the present. Yeah.
Maybe I can just jump in. I mean, just to remind everyone, the modus operandi of the format is usually that we ask the question, so we are kind of out of the way, and then Galaad will jump in, and then the students and the audience. So just to
Yes,
remind,
yes, indeed. Sorry, I forgot to mention your turn is coming.
We're just taking the advantage of being the loudest at the beginning. I just would like to, I mean, first of all, thank you for your lecture. I think it was really, it's incredible to actually see what Milica said, this kind of inquisition that one might have about materials actually, carried out, because it's really something that we should, be much more confronted with as architects. I think this is really, or designers for what it matters. And I think that there is perhaps a more increasing interest in general. I would just like to perhaps point at one particular point, let's say sentence and let's say idea that you mentioned in your book, which is, I mean, I guess that the reason why you formulated as a question is not a coincidence. It's because it's difficult to answer, but you were talking about how designers actually would make the decisions about materials, or I'm guessing, let's say, about projects in general, and the kind of Diller and Scofidio example also points at the difficulties to, how your project ages, right? You said it was the most, informed decision that they could make at the time, and I think that now, as we are, more and more aware of the origins perhaps of our materials, and I just mentioned earlier as we were chatting that in our seminar we're also looking at wood, and Chris, who's also there, would definitely have questions about that. But apparently the kind of official way of making wood legal is anyway very much fraud. So it is actually not, I mean, there is no such thing as sustainability in materials, it appears, right? I mean, if we follow that logic, everything is sourced somewhere, and the way it's sourced is potentially harmful. And that means that as a designer, you're basically confronted with this question of how do you use those materials, right? So I was just wondering if you had any perhaps directions. I'm obviously not asking for an answer because that's way too difficult, but like, do you have let's say path to point at that could be useful also for the audience here, which is very much like our designers in the making, and this idea, I think you point also at this idea that there might be a shift in public perceptions. I think we could perhaps touch briefly on accountability and how that would be something promising for how we deal with materials in the built environment.
Yeah, definitely right that there's no, I don't think there's any easy answers, but I mean, I think you could think about it in terms of, I think originally I thought, okay, this is about like figuring out which materials to use. And then I think I quickly realized that was going nowhere, because I think like in the Ipe example, it's like every generation thinks they have the right material. Like now we've got redwood, and then we've got mahogany, then we've got pressure treated, and each one, I think if it becomes the kind of solution, really just reproduces the same patterns of not recognizing the limits and the relationships that are a part of it. So so on the one hand, I think, yeah, there is something about the choices a designer makes based on what's available. And that's always, I think, always at play, but I think that's also very limited based on what's available. And I think it's really, really hard thing to do. But then I guess there's also the question of what ideas are conveyed through a design project and what debates are engaged. So like maybe all the way from something like maybe more like on the one hand, maybe at the more minimal level, like some kind, and this is something I think landscape architecture has done for done a lot of in the last couple decades, like more didactic, like revelatory work, where it's like we're gonna demonstrate aspects about the environment through the project, to maybe ideas that are more confrontational, you know, about the material itself, or about the material history itself. And then I guess also, so yeah, like what the actual design itself can communicate or engender in a conversation, I think is another question. And then what, you know, what is a designer, what's actually acted upon or spoken about, like how, what things do people reject, you know, like what kinds of projects are rejected. And I think I know that you've been talking about a moratorium on, right? This is something I want to learn more about, but you know, ideas like that, like what does it mean to kind of stop something or reject something, or work in solidarity with a specific movement? Like what those are, these seem like, of course, no answers, but a kind of spectrum of ways of acting.
Right.
Yeah.
But just to jump in on that, because I think, and this was a question we had in our seminar when we were reading your text. It wasn't clear to us, for instance, and that is pointing at the accountability not only of the public but of designers, which was how, you know, and this is again because it's kind of almost like a zeitgeist question, you know, like we probably wouldn't have thought about using those leftovers. Palisades of, you know, let's say leftover woods, I mean, basically ruins for that new project, if there was not like a kind of public accountability brought to the fore regarding the use of that wood. And I just wonder, you know, how come we as designers have not thought about this ahead of it, right? So I'm kind of like being a little bit aggressive, because I think that there are some questions that somehow as designers who think and whose job is actually to propose solutions that are innovative and working for everyone, are also able to bring these things before they're actually required, right?
I totally agree with you. I guess I feel very conscious about how easy it is as like somebody who's not just like building. Yeah, like I have to like give so many props to everybody who's doing that and struggling to make those kinds of decisions. But I really, it seems like the possibility to, I think you're getting at like really reuse, right? Is that what you're talking about? Yeah, like the actual, or like let's say really, right, or like really getting into the value, like the non-commoditized value of materials, whether that's like elongating them, kind of caring for them in different ways. All of, I feel that strongly. I think that is, in my opinion, that is the direction. It doesn't at all solve the problem for somebody who has to make a kind of giant new landscape on the waterfront, like maybe they're at right now, you know, like, but it does, but I think it does the kind of direction of valuing materials for more than what they are worth in this particular moment in time, in this particular system, is very important. And I think the more that we do that, or like create models for that, the more likely, you know, we'll know what to do when things change.
Yeah, but I mean, your work is essential in that sense, because, you know, without the research, we can't really articulate those like the urgencies. I think everyone feels it, but, you know, the kind of hard work of showing what's wrong, I think, is really something that needs to be done in any case. I'm gonna let my colleagues ask the questions, perhaps Hans, and then of course Galaad, whom we've invited and are excited to hear also his take and perhaps questions for you, Jane.
Thanks.
Thank you for your presentation. It was super interesting. Just very quickly, I think it touches upon many points that Charlotte mentioned already. The notion of obsolescence and durability was super interesting, and it somehow reminded me also on the practice on landscape architecture and how it's different to the practice of architecture. And what are the historic examples that one, because it's not so long ago that landscape architecture was much more focused on this kind of, or is again also refocused on kind of time aspects in the project. That architecture, that is maybe different in architecture, and what to be found in these projects. In that sense, it was interesting that you didn't touch upon the landscape architecture aspects of the project, but more their architectural parts, but
yeah, maybe especially these chapters do that a little bit more. Yeah,
the trees probably are much more.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I think this, because there is the moments of care or maintenance could be also much more present in landscape architectural projects, and the locality is naturally a part of the project as much as time is also in many projects. I was wondering if you think, what happened to landscape architecture in the sense that durability suddenly became so foregrounded?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think maybe what I trying to do, or how I'm thinking about it, is to try, like the mental experiment for me is to see them as the same, like to see the welding of the steel as like part of the Misabi range, and maybe also in the presentations I do, there's so much more I think to get into in terms of the ideologies or the design intentions, but maybe I'm trying, because the idea is to kind of make them equal, like make the place where the material is coming from, like they're obviously not equal, but like kind of equivalent in terms of time spent. I think I kind of I like lean more heavily on the other place, because at least in my experience, the design landscape is the one that kind of gets all of our love. But yeah, no, I think that the idea, I mean, especially in the trees chapter and the first chapter, which is about fertilizer, I think those cases are much more about, the fertilizer is actually only present for a trace, like it's like a season. And then the trees are tended, every week for years and decades. And so I think those two cases start to take a different temporality. But I think we can also think about, steel as something that gets embedded, that's equally kind of like moving and temporal. It's easy not to, because in let's say in my lifetime, maybe the steel's there the whole time, but in the big picture, even of a couple of centuries of the city, it's kind of like coming and going. And in the larger scale, in the millions and billions of years, it's really coming and going. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I take for sure the kind of different, the way the disciplines consider or discuss temporality. I think that's a really important thing.
It does, definitely. I mean, of course, it's important, and that's the whole point of the project, to incorporate the other part of the landscape within the landscape project as well.
Hans, thanks, and then perhaps we'll turn to Galaad now.
Thanks,
who's been patiently waiting while everyone was asking questions. So Galaad, please join us for this round of discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Charlotte, and thank you very much, Jane, for the presentation, and which I found extremely stimulating and thought-provoking, just as the book is. And maybe I'll just, I had also prepared several questions about design responsibility, and some of the questions are already mentioned now by the other respondents. And but I think maybe I might actually continue on the answer that you just gave, which I thought was also connected to another facet of the reaction that I had to the book. And the idea of the book Reciprocal Landscape as a kind of almost like kind of unspoken challenging of certain binary oppositions that are still maybe too often taken for granted. And one, for instance, which is a very big one, obviously, which is the one, the opposition between nature and culture. And now you just mentioned this kind of almost geological, deep time question. And in your chapter on steel, we also propose at some point to look at Manhattan as a material flow with new strata of glass, concrete, and steel that are gradually added. And you also describe the use of, and I don't know how intentional that was, but you also describe the use of steel as an almost organic growth. So, and I'm quoting you here, an X-ray of Riverside Park and the entire west side of Manhattan would reveal an island-sized organism with interminable vertebrae of steel girders and columns and limbs of spurs. It rises from the south and then plunges underground around 30th Street, tunneling through Riverside Park, and then emerges until it becomes the Hudson River Bridge at the northern tip of Manhattan. So I was quite struck by this organic analogy. And I was wondering also in this kind of more, and also not only the political or economic implications that material use has, but also the more cultural or intellectual ones. I was wondering if an idea of growth of the material and of a kind of continuum throughout the overground and underground reality of Manhattan. Do you see the construction of landscape architecture or infrastructure by humans as a kind of natural history somehow, not something dissociated from nature? And what would be your opinion on the nature culture binary today, let's say in architectural or landscape architectural scholarship? Do you think it's still helpful in any way, or do you think we need to move also beyond that frame of historiographic or design research endeavors?
Can you say the last sentence again?
Is it still helpful in any way to use those binaries, or as you seem to do it yourself, having a more integrated view? Might that be a kind of direction that that landscape architectural scholarship should embrace more?
Thank you. I'm always happy that things are being recorded, because I'm like, I'm gonna go back and listen to all these. These have all been really wonderful questions, so thanks everybody. Yeah, I think maybe one of the reasons why I find that helpful to myself to, like you're saying, kind of like go between more organic analogies and geological and say vegetation, is because I think for me, the project is like literally trying to see something outside of, it's very simple, like just trying to see something not as a 2x4, or trying to see the other states beyond the singular state. And it's I find it very difficult. And I spend a lot of time looking at my plywood table here and just like trying to imagine, you know, other forms it has taken and will take. And so let's say the notion of steel kind of moving into Manhattan as infrastructure. I guess I'm always interested in the kind of like political and social underpinnings of that, but I am like awed by the scale of it and the I guess the enormity of it as a kind of massive historical flow. I think I'm able to understand the politics more when I can see it as the kind of like aspects of the earth being rearranged. And this is something that I think I was really inspired when I read 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History by Manuel de Landa, who kind of just basically is telling urban history and this like concretization of or the calcification of cities. And I think that really stuck with me as a way to understand these more abstract concepts as something that is happening, whether by by wind or currents or capitalism. And capitalism is also obviously the kind of main power kind of producing the flows in the format that they are. But as far as the binaries, I mean, I think it's pretty hard to avoid them. I think that I think it needs to be confronted all the time because they're so deep, at least in like my world and my mind. They're so deep that I think it's essential to like, I kind of can't do anything without like forcing myself to I mean, I guess understand how those binaries, how white supremacy, how all of these other like encoded realities are shaping the way I see the world. So yeah, I think the binaries are there. So we have to deal with them no matter what, even if we don't want
to. But because I had the feeling in some of the things that you mentioned when talking about certain materials that you're looking at, and for instance, steel, you actually mentioned it again in your presentation, how actually iron ore is a direct result of biological life, you know, being present on Earth, and how it basically fixated or deposited this formerly dissolved iron, you know, into a solid form that was then exploitable, you know, by us humans somehow billions of years later. And actually, if you look at the other components of steel, you also realize that they're always related to a former type of life. So for instance, coal, as we know, as other fossil fuels, is a kind of, you know, ancient life. And then even the limestone is actually also, you know, the product of algae or kind of bacterial activity in the ocean. So in a way, there is a kind of, by going deeper into the geological and kind of the history of the generation of those materials, you also relate them directly to life, and somehow that also blurs, you know, the kind of separation or this dissociation that we feel from the non-living, or what we feel is a non-living realm. And and I was quite happy to see that you actually, you know, took or made this effort of connecting to this geological history of the materials, and through doing this, I think challenges kind of de facto what we feel as a you know, a gap between us and the non-living and inert, so-called inert matter.
Thanks. That's really nice, or I don't know, interestingly put. And I guess, yeah, maybe all of these things are just ways to break up these, you know, like kind of fixed categories of, you know, what's plastic, what's metal, what's earth, what's not. Even wood, like wood is the soil, you know, trees are the soil, any of these things. There's no simple lines.
But yeah, Charlotte, you wanted to?
No, Galaad, I just wanted to ping pong a little bit because I know a little bit of your work, and I was wondering how, you know, Jane's kind of research was also informing your kind of interest in this kind of ontologies of materials, and also discussing, is there like these new ways, like in a way, asking this kind of shift in how we look at materials, also as designers, but as researchers, beyond their kind of structural performance, and you know, being a kind of adding this kind of layer of criticality on how we actually look at them, and I know that you've been, you know, pursuing this kind of obsessive research on certain ways that that materials are used in various forms, and I was wondering if there is any if these kind of new ways that is maybe integrating political economy, but also almost like a, you know, like almost like somebody who would be doing detective work actually has to do. So this kind of merge way of approaching materials is something that would be creating, these new ontologies of materials as something that you would be perhaps able to reflect upon. But I just kind of bridging a little bit you two.
I would love to hear that too.
Well, yeah.
And I also know from just a little bit of, like, in addition to that, I think you're also looking at kind of ideologies and how things are, I don't know if marketed is the right word, but how meaning is conveyed. So anyways, I'm super interested in hearing about that too.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll be able to tell you a lot about all this in 5 years' time when I finished my research, because I only just started it. I'm really myself, trying to tackle all those questions at the moment. But actually, I was quite interested also in your epilogue, because I felt that it connected maybe to some of the questions that I'm asking myself at the moment, because you offer kind of 3 prescriptions or proposals in there as to how to, in a way, react to the rather grim, portrait that you paint of those material realities and implications of material use. And one of them, for instance, the third one, is one that I would say relates in a way to this idea of material eloquence. And I had, maybe I'll just quote it. So you say, third, how can the act of design itself actually address some of the larger material relationships at play in the materials used to construct it? There is a long-standing tradition of didactic landscapes architecture projects intending to teach people something through references and symbolic approaches. But perhaps designers could assemble materials to actually communicate more about them, about the source landscape, their formation and labor behind them. If at the core of current ecological crises lies a profound separation from land, from the consequences and interdependencies of that humans share with the land, how can material design engage this? The textures, smells, structures of particular materials give people tactile and intimate contact with fragments of distant landscapes and their myriad social and ecological relationships. And that's precisely what, the kind of what I would like to also find in design and in case studies that I would like to investigate. So here you really point to the kind of potential of design in its rather aesthetical facets to foster an alternative engagement with materials and with matter. Yet, this tactile and intimate contact is often made invisible. And I wonder by what, if it's maybe the processing of materials. For instance, the Ipe wood on the High Line, doesn't expose any of those implications itself, let's say intrinsically. It's not Ipe wood from a specific region from the Amazon, no, it's just wood when you experience it, when you're there. And so I was wondering, so how could aesthetical material strategies be that would allow to manifest all this? Do you know then of designs that are not the ones that you talk about in your book, but of those examples of this didactic landscape architecture and symbolic that you mentioned, and that actually managed to achieve that, to create this deep connection with a material, or are working towards actualizing maybe this agenda by means of design in contemporary practice?
I feel like I should, because that's the conclusion of my book. Oh no!
No, because I was wondering, then, is this the next book somehow? Because then I was really curious to hear what could be then good practice, or what could be designs that actually manage to actually to not lapse into this exploitative behavior in a way.
Yeah, I don't have like any references like offhand, but I guess I do think it's probably happening all over the place. Like, it's probably happening in like, I'm kind of used to, from my last years of teaching, kind of having these precedents like the ones I'm showing in the book, these kind of like well-known high design precedents. But I guess I'm thinking that this type of thing is happening in many places where people are like rebuilding a connection to land. So I think that's maybe a little bit abstract and maybe not what you're asking for, but I think wherever there is, yeah, I guess an intention to get to know the local ecosystem and to kind of reconnect to some of the knowledge and practices that Milica was talking about. And I think that's where you could probably find really great examples of what you're raising.
I mean, I could say perhaps I'm really kind of excited that you phrased it in this way, rebuilding a connection to land, no? And my sense is that it kind of occurred to me in this discussion that perhaps our focus on design is not really the right one. It's more about the land, and we talk about, I mean, we have a notion, we have the entire discipline called sustainable construction, but we speak very little about sustainable harvesting, no? And so these are, let's say, in practical terms, I mean, these would be the activities that happen at those reciprocal landscapes, right? So sustainable harvesting has to happen somewhere in order for sustainable construction to happen somewhere else, right? So we have not, to say so, established this picture. And, I think I mean, our, to say so, general knowledge tells us that it's possible to harvest and wood and steel and many other materials sustainably, right? It's possible to feed ourselves sustainably, right? The problem occurs when you have the kind of industrial operation that comes into a forest and begins the kind of clearance of the forest. I mean, I mean, if you look at other examples of forest management, if you look at, let's say, traditional examples, if you look at what happens in Switzerland, I mean, nothing like that can happen. I mean, this is simply insane, right? In order to, one has to cut wood in a very precise manner. The trees of a certain age can be cut, in a forest. I mean, that's what's called sustainable management, right? You cannot go cutting every single tree. So in fact, what is happening is completely, wasteful, destructive, and somehow ignorant also, right? I mean, better practices do exist, right? The question is, why is that happening at that place, right? So there is a kind of exploitative model is set up, where I guess, kind of profit and speed and so on are prioritized over the kind of conditions of sustainability of that site. Also, some asymmetries are explored, right? Obviously, because that's probably, I mean, it happens on indigenous land. It happens on the land where rights of the owners, to say so, rightful owners are neglected or mistreated and so on. So let's say, I think that we most of the time we know or even have the better models of how to do it, but the problem is that a lot of time this is not observed, right? So in fact, or even a lot of the time, the kind of a vast majority of the cases are based on that exploitative industrial, to say so, I don't know how further to call it, let's say the kind of monoculture model, no? I mean, why are we doing that, right? Why can't we, to say so, protect better practices, right? Or promote better practices? I mean, because it's harder in that model to achieve economies of scale, right? It's harder to have global competitive market pricing. It's hard to have corporations, right? I mean, if we went back to that model, we would essentially have to say so to localize or to kind of have very different very different I would say economic networks that are producing certain architectures, right? And I think these would, I think they would be better models. They would be empowering. But I mean, cities like New York are large machines that, to say so, demand to say so scale, right? So and it's somewhere in that. How do you supply the amount of materials that is consumed by that, to say so, mega organism, right? So I think that is also a challenge, right? So in a way, the kind of localizing is the practices and kind of scaling down is, to say so, in the contradiction with the very logic of cities, right? That are, to say so, build up on these economies of scale. No? So I think that's where certain, I don't think it's impossible somehow. I think it's an interesting challenge, to say so, intellectually, politically, to reset. And I also totally agree with you, Galaad, that there is an ethical component in all that, right? So that there is a kind of to say so, let's say, of the kind of ethics of the nature-culture relationship, well, some aspects I don't think need to be rebuilt. I mean, perhaps certain things have to be remembered, right? And I think remembered through practice, right? To kind of concrete forms of practice. No. So somehow I perhaps I would like to just underline that kind of excitement I felt thinking about the rebuilding connection with land and sustainable harvesting in addition to sustainable construction, as something which is the kind of a missing bit.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's what you're saying is like, what if those were not separate? Like what if, so whatever is being discussed as sustainable construction is the same, like is obviously a land practice rather than only a building, or rather than, like what if rather than thinking about like an involvement in this slice of the flow, the discussion about sustainable building really involved all of it. And I think in some ways it does, like there's, different mechanisms for that, but what if, I mean, I think that's what I mentioned that the 1,000 years of nonlinear history, because it's possible to see these things at like, it's possible to think about like, what if the making of a city was a land practice, like what if that was about orchestrating material flows in ways that elongated their life and supported biodiversity in the periphery, and like all of these things, which just are, it's kind of no one's job to do all of that, but I feel like it's all of our jobs to work to like support things, support what we think needs to happen. It's hard to even say these things because they seem so naive or utopian, but yeah, what would it mean to think that all of this work is about trying to make the materials flow differently, in a way that was not so harmful and was benefiting different communities. Yeah.
I think Milica's great point also in kind of also, I mean, I think it's hopeful to see these materials with the idea that it's still possible to somehow do that kind of exploitation, sustainably. I actually, the more I research, the more I actually question, the very use of the term sustainable construction. I mean, I make sometimes joke with colleagues and said, it's like saying sustainable oil rigs, because we all know that there is a moment where the materials that we're using in the way we construct are just not sustainable, and that can never be sustainable. So I think it's nice to look at these things and shift.
I tend to agree about oil, but I think with wood we have a chance.
But the day where we will have sustainable oil rigs is coming. I've seen, like, my husband showed me yesterday a caterpillar. You know, it's a caterpillar like the kind I have in the back, but it's like powered with it's like a kind of an electrical one, and I'm just like, oh my god, you know, like this is where it's like green capitalism is driving us to that kind of fallacy, and I think we're too inclined to believe in this because it's also comfortable at many levels. So but I think it's great to kind of circle around these questions, also admitting that the answers are not that easy, that they are kind of you know, complicated, and that we need to also busy ourselves to kind of look for solutions. So I'm happy to hear also that there are also some directions that are not only that we're not completely doomed, though. Yeah, maybe we are. Anyway, maybe so we are. Maybe we are. Maybe that's okay. I'm just going to turn to our audience, and I know that some of our students have questions, so I'm going to turn to Chris, who is part of our seminar and has been also investigating your readings, and then I see that there are also some questions. So Chris, you have a question for Jane.
Sure. So thank you again so much for the lecture. It was really interesting, I thought, how you often switch between this idea of who we give agency to, you know, in terms of, you know, debt slavery, indigenous voices, etc., but also what we give agency to. So the idea that maybe these materials have some value more than what we can simply place on them, but that they have agency within themselves. And your research often almost accounts for this idea of the non-human, in which you switch back and forth between these different perspectives. Like with the trees, you go over, you know, not the anthropocentric study of what they could be used for, but how these are objects with lives within themselves, which I thought was really interesting. So I wanted to ask you, in this future of, I guess, the non-human, you talk about larger timescales that are kind of beyond what not only one person could experience, but, you know, what a people could experience. How do you kind of place this idea of the practice past that of the non-human? So architecture is usually defined as a almost humanistic practice, or one that's for humanists. The idea that, like, it's rooted in our own ideas of proportion, of beauty, of being human, etc. How do you kind of see the practice changing from being post-human, I guess?
Thanks, Chris. That's really interesting. I wish I could just like come back in 2 hours, because maybe I would have some more ways to think about that. I don't know. I mean, I guess like thinking about practices that extend, maybe as far as I could go is to think about practices that extend beyond like a single life, or which I guess a lot of like landscape change and construction could, you know. So what are the you know, what are the soil practices or what's kind of being set up for a future beyond one's own experience? Seems to me to be like an important question. Like what will you not be able to experience that you're, or that maybe that no what are you designing or participating in that maybe no human will ever get to experience, and what are the qualities of that? Of course you can't know that, but just somehow, I guess, like for me, it's just a matter, or it's just like another challenge of trying to see actions as like extending beyond the limited viewpoint, like the limited time frame in which I'm used to like caring about things. So I don't know. I have a feeling I don't really know the answer to your, or I don't really have an answer to your question, but I guess I'm interested in like how different people can imagine their work as part of like a big movement towards some other future, I guess. Yeah. But anyways, I'd be curious to know what you think.
But I think isn't it like as designers, we should never think about things that would not kind of overlive us, right? I think that's kind of clear, and I think just to look at this with a larger time span is anyway something that is definitely important to address all these questions of materials. I think Shira had a question, and then there is a really great question by Maria, but I'm just letting perhaps the audience also jump in. Shira, would you like to ask a question to Jane?
Sure. Thanks. Thank you for this lecture and conversation. I was wondering, back to your book, how you ended up choosing New York as your kind of site of consumption, let's call it, for the different materials. I'm asking, I think, from a position where New York is an often studied and unknown place.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, Shira. Yeah, I was living in Boston at the time, and I think honestly, I was just kind of visiting a lot, and I was also, I think there's a few things. One was that partly it's like it could have been anywhere. Like the site could have been anywhere. So, but there's something useful about choosing these cases that are so overdone, like that are so it's like, I've heard about Central Park a million times, to be able to show something that is maybe not known about it. So I guess that was kind of the strategy of it. But I think by the end, I kind of was wishing that I hadn't chose it for the, mostly, I guess, just because it's like another book that's focused on this place that does, even though the intention is to try to like overturn that dominance, it kind of just also contributes to it. So I feel mixed about that. But maybe another from a research point of view, another part of it was that it made finding a lot of this information a lot easier, because these are all places that are so well documented. There's like such deep archives, that it like probably helped me find information that maybe would have been difficult if I had chosen my hometown of Edmonton, Alberta, or and also I feel like it's a really important question that you're asking, like for any research project, like what are the implications of the site that you choose, whether it's, in this case, it's kind of has a symbolic reasoning. But yeah, how does that affect like who's interested in it, or what kinds of messages it conveys? I think it's something I'll think about if I make another book in a different way. Thanks.
If there is any question from the audience, you guys can maybe prepare that while I'm reading one question, which is actually very good, from Maria Marich, who had to leave. It's also in the chat, but she asks, how does one tell the story of the material? Saying this kind of research is forcing us to abandon the usual architectural media used to represent and discuss the built environment. Mapping can oversimplify the displacement and movement of culturally and environmentally complex objects such as wood or steel. Does this kind of research bring in the need to extend the media and formats of talking about the built environment, such as turning towards storytelling or hybrid forms of mapping? Of course, this is going down our alley, since we're working with producing video materials. So that would be, for instance, one answer. But would you like to give some thoughts on that question?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and this is totally why, Charlotte, I hope I can talk to you about your videos, as a whole class making these videos, because I really think that kind of format seems extra important, because I think with well, for me, the photographs have always been a really important part, like almost as important as the writing, to convey the research. But also I think the ability of video to share sound, or like people's voices, testimonials, all of that seems like something that mapping, can't do alone. So I think I like, the photography and video or film collage, I don't know, different forms of kind of like media collage that are able to bring together different scales of information, different kind of authorities, seems important.
Well, yeah, it's an experiment, so I'll keep you posted very much. But I just want to look back on that to Milica, perhaps, because actually it's a conversation we have had recently on, how photography is actually also the limits of it, right? In addressing the complexities of what this material extraction is about. And I mean, you have beautifully assembled that lecture, by the way. It's very impressive, the kind of care that you've taken in putting these spectacular images, archive images together to really tell that story. So even if video is moving, nevertheless, I think that there is also a great way to tell the stories in that sense. But just maybe Milica to ask a few thoughts about that, because I know that this is also something you've been writing about, and we've talked about that. On the role of the medium in telling these kind of stories, which really need to be told, right? And also beyond the sublime of destruction, we've also talked about that. I mean, that image behind me is not doing justice, or perhaps it is exactly illustrating that kind of attraction we have to these destructive sublimes, right? So maybe you could give a few thoughts also to that.
I mean, these. We have seen, I mean, one example would be the kind of sublime destruction would be at Burtynsky, right? This kind of really monumental landscapes of kind of devastation, coal mining, stone mining, I don't know, the kind of shipyards in Bangladesh, many other the toxic spills. I mean, with the taken as in a kind of aerial photography and so on. And I think it is interesting on the one hand. I mean, there is of course this kind of saturation with those images. I mean, we are familiar with them, so this is in a way the additional difficulty of that narration, right? Is to penetrate to the kind of emotional level and to make people aware in a very sensual way, this is really happening, and to not trigger the kind of empathic reaction, so that is difficult. I think we are becoming better at it. I mean, part of the story here, I mean, there are a couple of concepts we've been using to talk about these issues. I mean, one has to do with city centrism, so the kind of fundamental, cultural, to say so, orientation towards cities as objects of interest. So we to say so, there is a kind of culturally, there is, to say so, abstraction and lack of knowledge, lack of interest, and this extends to the, let's say, research funding, so the kind of effort to talk about the sites that are beyond, that are precisely the so-called the territory of extended effects of urbanization is what we, see less, know less about. And then we also have this discussion or discourse on visibility, and what is, to say so, culturally visible, but also what is invisibilized, for various reasons, power asymmetries, other types of asymmetries, right? So this has to do with rights, with who has access to having a voice, having, to say so, a control over land or resources and so on. I mean, that was interestingly the visibility, right, in territorial terms is very important. I've been recently, I mean, example from the Amazon, the kind of fight of indigenous groups. In some cases, I've been aware of the case of Yanomami in Venezuela who have fought for their representation on Google Earth, right? So the sites and paths and you know the to say so areas that mark their indigenous land should be visible on Google Earth, otherwise they don't exist, right? So in a way, they don't have legitimacy, neither, you know, with the nation state or with other, to say so, international agencies in claiming the right on their territory, right? So that comes back, or to say so, falls back on the idea of sustainable harvesting. I believe that the true stewards of the land who know the land will never cut the forest like that company, no? They you know, the people who know the land will not harvest resource unsustainably, no? The people who understand its ecology and its relationships. So I am, you know, very focused on the kind of idea of knowledge, right? Of kind of living, that knowledge landscape is related to social practice and is related to knowledge. We have to give the right to harvesting the resource to those who know the land, right? So those rights cannot be sold. So in a way, this goes to the kind of problem of global capitalism. We cannot sell concessions for harvesting to some kind of companies who do not understand the land or landscape, right? So the kind of to say so, the fight for indigenous rights is in that sense also really ecological. It's not only social and political. It's about the knowledge of let's say, you know, being able to say so, to harvest or to use what is there sustainably has to do with knowledge, no? And I think that the kind of you know, the kind of globalized supply chains. I mean, what happened strangely is that in that, to say so, globalization of practices, the knowledge is lost. I cannot explain how, you know. I mean, we have created, to say so, expert cultures, you know, and there is a lot of belief in expertise, but in fact, we see that a lot of this, to say so, expert practice can be damaging, right? So in a way that the knowledge somehow on some level is lost, right? So you know, so I think that this kind of restoring this balance or rebuilding a connection with the land really has to do with that symmetry. I mean, city and land has to be, you know, reimagined together in some kind of a ecological, natural continuum. I agree with Galaad. City is as natural as everything else, right? And you know, and but let's say this kind of in that sense. I mean, I think Manuel de Landa was also kind of visionary in the sense that, you know, perhaps we can imagine that cities will be, in fact, you know, if we can build that kind of a to say so, different relationship, you know, that cities will become places that can in fact promote or a really kind of a positive kind of, you know, ecologies, right, around them. I mean, even that is imaginable, but it requires a completely different culture of living, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's I personally, I'm not terribly pessimistic. I just think it's a really kind of huge project. I mean, I'm really nervous, like, can we do it, right? I really think it can happen, but there's such a kind of tremendous task. I mean, so many things have to be retrofitted completely, right? It's like entire, you know, everything we have should be, to say so, reset a little bit differently, right? And I hope we can do it. And I mean, I find this series and your talk, Jane. I mean, everything was really inspiring, and I'm growing more optimistic, let's say, session by session, you know, strangely enough.
Nice. Maybe before we leave, Jane, would you like to perhaps conclude and have a few thoughts? Or
I would just say thanks everybody so much. It's really wonderful to chat with you and hear the things you're thinking about. And thanks so much for inviting me to join you.
No, thank you for your great lecture and this opportunity to have this great conversation. Galaad, would you actually like to add anything as well? Sorry, I just...
No, I mean, yeah, also thank you. And I really appreciated your last words also, Milica. And that's also a question that I'm asking myself, and indeed, how can architect also related to design and to our postures as designers, and how can we actually participate in a discourse and a kind of refocusing and kind of cultural reprogrammation almost, and in a kind of very transversal way. And I think it's a very ambitious but also exciting task at times. So I also oscillate sometimes between moments of optimism and moments of discouragement, but I think that it's better to stay on the optimistic side as you're doing.
Yeah, and I think that the kind of task that we are undertaking with this kind of conversation also pushes forward, and is also something that has a place and should perhaps more prominently represented in architecture schools in general. So I really appreciate that we are able to have this space here. So thank you, everybody, and thank you for that really great conversation. I feel like we had the space also incredibly generously shared by Jane to also, you know, frontally address the fact that those questions are basically difficult to answer, and that we should basically keep on working on this you know, issues. I think that it was really great to be able to discuss that with all of you. So thank you very much, Galaad, also for joining us, and for everyone who was asking questions. Milica, would you like to close the session, or Hans? I don't
Maybe
know.
I could add. Thank you,
Yes.
of course, also to Jane and Galaad, and to everybody to join us today, and to join us again in 2 weeks for the last session with Anna Tsing. We will probably not solve all the questions, but maybe we will bring up some more. 26th. Yeah, join us please again. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Galaad.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great
Bye-bye.
time. Have a good
Week.
spring.
Afternoon.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye.